Welcome back. I've got a special story to share today.
Arthur Vance sneered as he kicked the empty chair away from the mahogany table in front of the 20 dinner guests. The screech of wood against marble echoed through the grand dining hall, silencing the clink of heavy silver and the polite murmur of the city's elite. Beside him, Elena Vance felt her daughter's small hand tighten in hers, the 6-year-old's fingers trembling against her palm. "A Vance seat is earned by birth, Elena," Arthur said, his voice carrying effortlessly to the back of the room where the local judge and the district attorney sat watching. "Not by a signature on an adoption paper. I won't have the Vance bloodline diluted by a girl who doesn't even know her own father's name." Elena didn't flinch. She stood in her modest navy dress, a stark contrast to the shimmering silk and tailored tuxedos surrounding her. The air in the room was thick with the cloying scent of white lilies and the expensive, earthy aroma of Arthur's favorite cigars. She could feel the heat of 20 pairs of eyes on her, some filled with pity, others with the same cold arrogance that defined her husband. Beatrice Vance, Arthur's mother, didn't even look up from her plate. She delicately sliced a piece of Wagyu beef, her diamonds catching the light of the crystal chandelier. "Arthur is right, dear," she murmured, her voice like velvet-wrapped steel. "It's an anniversary gala, not a charity ward. Maya can eat in the kitchen with the staff. I'm sure they have some scraps left." A ripple of stifled laughter moved through the table. Elena looked at Julian Vance, Arthur's younger brother. For a moment, she saw a flash of discomfort in his eyes, but he quickly looked away, taking a long sip of his vintage Bordeaux. He was the golden child, the one who always played along to keep the peace, while Elena had spent years playing the role of the dutiful, quiet wife, the ER nurse who was lucky to have married into such prestige. "The girl stays," Elena said, her voice low and remarkably steady. Arthur stepped closer, invading her personal space. He smelled of scotch and success. He leaned down, his face inches from hers, his eyes narrowed into slits of pure contempt. "You're an enabler of a fantasy, Elena. You think because you wear the name you have a say. You're a guest in this house, a temporary one if you keep testing my patience." He turned to the server, a young man who looked like he wanted to vanish into the wallpaper. "Take the setting away. Now." Elena watched as the crystal water glass, beaded with cold condensation, was whisked away, followed by the gold-rimmed china. The empty space at the table felt like a gaping wound. This was the second time this week Arthur had publicly reminded her of her place. On Tuesday, he had canceled her credit cards in front of her colleagues at the hospital. Today, he was stripping her daughter of her dignity. Her nails dug into the leather of her clutch, where a heavy brass key sat hidden in the interior pocket. It was a key Arthur didn't know she possessed, the key to Aunt Martha's private study at the far end of the estate. Everyone assumed the old woman had died senile and penniless, leaving the entire Vance legacy to Arthur. But Elena had spent the last 3 nights in that dusty room, reading through ledgers that told a very different story. "I see," Elena said. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She simply looked at the empty space where her daughter was supposed to sit, then back at the man she had once thought she loved. "Good," Arthur smirked, straightening his silk tie. He turned back to the table, raising his glass of champagne. "Now, as I was saying, the merger with the Sterling Group will solidify our hold on the downtown district. By next quarter, the Vance name will be the only one that matters in this city." Elena leaned down and whispered into Maya's ear, "Go to the car, honey. I'll be right there." She watched the girl run out of the hall, her small footsteps fading against the marble. Elena didn't follow immediately. Instead, she walked to the head of the table. The room went quiet again. She reached out and picked up Arthur's glass of champagne. For a heartbeat, Arthur looked confused. "What are you?" Elena didn't throw it. She didn't make a scene. She simply held the glass up to the light, watching the bubbles rise. "You're right about one thing, Arthur," she said, her voice loud enough for the judge to lean in. "Bloodlines are important, but ownership is absolute." She set the glass back down on the table with a sharp clack. "Aunt Martha always said you were too arrogant to read the fine print. I used to think she was just being bitter." Arthur's face flushed a deep, angry red. "Don't you dare bring that old woman's name into this house. She was a guest here, just like you." "We'll see," Elena replied. She felt a strange, cold calm settling over her, a sensation like ice water flowing through her veins. The rage was there, but it was directed now, sharpened into a blade. She glanced at the clock on the wall, an antique pendulum that ticked with rhythmic, heartbeat precision. She had 2 days. 2 days until the probate hearing that Arthur thought was a mere formality. 2 days until the merger he was bragging about met a legal wall he couldn't climb. "You're dismissed, Elena," Arthur snapped, gesturing toward the door. "Go play mother in the driveway. We have business to discuss." Elena turned without another word. She walked through the foyer, past the portraits of Vance ancestors who looked down with frozen, judgmental eyes. She felt the weight of the brass key against her hip. Arthur thought he was the master of this domain, the wolf who had finally cleared the pack of its weakest members. As she stepped out into the cool night air, she didn't feel like a victim. She felt like a hunter who had just finished setting the first trap. She climbed into her modest sedan, pulled Maya into a hug, and looked back at the glowing windows of the mansion. Arthur was still inside, laughing and toasting to a future that was already slipping through his fingers. He hadn't noticed the shadow moving across the lawn, or the fact that the temporary guest had just taken the first step toward becoming the landlord. Elena put the car in gear. She had one more phone call to make before the sun rose, a call to a lawyer who had been waiting 20 years for someone to find that brass key. 2 days, Arthur," she whispered into the dark. "Wait for it." The next morning, the sterile, antiseptic scent of the emergency department offered a strange comfort to Elena Vance. Here, under the flickering hum of fluorescent lights, she wasn't the charity wife Arthur had tried to erase. She was the best trauma nurse on the floor. But the peace was shattered when a courier in a crisp uniform marched toward the central station, holding a thick envelope with a bright red urgent stamp. "Elena Vance?" the man asked, his voice carrying across the quiet morning lull. She nodded, her heart sinking as she recognized the gold-embossed seal of the Vance legal team. Her colleagues paused, their eyes darting from the monitor screens to the document in her hand. Elena tore it open. It wasn't just a divorce filing. It was a notice of immediate trespass. Arthur had filed an injunction to bar her from the estate, effective immediately. He wasn't just kicking her out. He was branding her a criminal if she so much as stepped onto the driveway to retrieve Maya's schoolbooks. "Is everything okay, Elena?" a younger nurse whispered, her eyes wide with pity. Elena felt the heat of humiliation crawling up her neck, but she didn't let her hands shake. She felt the heavy, cold weight of the brass key tucked into her scrub pocket. "It's just a desperate man making noise," she said, her voice like tempered steel. She tucked the papers away, but the rage was a living thing in her chest, hot and demanding. The phone at the station buzzed. She knew before she answered it. "Did you get my gift?" Arthur's voice was a smooth, oily purr in her ear. "I thought it was best to make things official before the foundation gala. I wouldn't want the staff to be confused about who actually belongs on the property." "You're stooping to process servers at my workplace, Arthur," she replied, stepping into a quiet supply closet. The smell of fresh linens and industrial cleaner pressed in on her. "That's a new low, even for you." "I'm simply cleaning house," he snapped, his facade of calm slipping into that familiar, jagged arrogance. "Julian is finally seeing you for what you are, a distraction. He's agreed to take his place as my primary heir, provided I handle the Maya situation. I've already had her things packed into trash bags. They're sitting by the curb near the service entrance. If you want them, I'd hurry. The weather forecast says rain." Elena's grip tightened on the phone until her knuckles turned white. The thought of Maya's drawings, her favorite stuffed rabbit, and her school awards sitting in garbage bags like refuse made her vision swim. "You are a monster," she whispered. "No, Elena, I'm a Vance," he said, and the line went dead. She didn't cry. Instead, she left the hospital on her lunch break, driving straight to a nondescript office building on the edge of the city. The sign on the door read Sterling and Associates. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old paper and expensive tobacco. An elderly man with eyes like flint looked up from a mahogany desk. He didn't ask for her name. He simply looked at the brass key she placed on the green felt blotter. 20 years, the lawyer murmured, his voice raspy. Martha said you'd be the one to find it. She always said Arthur had the greed, but you had the spine. What does it open? Elena asked. The lawyer pulled a heavy, leather-bound ledger from his drawer. Martha didn't trust the digital age, and she certainly didn't trust her nephew. This key doesn't just open a box, Elena. It opens a vault beneath the estate's library, a vault that contains the original, unamended deed to the Vance holdings, along with the records of every cent Arthur has diverted from the family trust to cover his gambling debts over the last decade. Elena felt a surge of adrenaline that made the ER's morning rush look like a nap. She touched the key, its jagged teeth feeling like a weapon. "The Foundation Gala is in 48 hours, she said, her mind already spinning. He's planning to announce Julian as his successor and finalize the new trust. Then you have 48 hours to get into that vault, the lawyer replied. If those documents come to light before the board of directors, Arthur won't just be penniless. He'll be a felon. Elena stood up, the weight of the last 10 years falling away. She thought of the trash bags on the curb, the sneer in Arthur's voice, and the way Maya had looked when she was told they couldn't go home. Let him have his party, Elena whispered, her eyes gleaming with a dangerous, quiet light. I want him at his highest point before I pull the floor out from under him. 2 days, Arthur, just 2 more days. She walked out of the office, the sun hitting her face. She didn't look like a nurse who had just been evicted. She looked like a woman who was about to set a kingdom on fire. The following evening, the Vance estate felt like a tomb of polished marble and cold intentions. Elena Vance stood in the foyer, the scent of expensive floor wax and lilies cloying in the air. Upstairs, the rhythmic muffled beat of a tailor's footsteps echoed through the hallway. Arthur was preparing for his coronation, and the house seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of his triumph. Elena walked toward the grand study, her nurse's shoes silent on the Persian rug. She found Arthur Vance standing on a pedestal in the center of the room, his arms outstretched as a tailor pinned the lapels of a midnight blue tuxedo. He looked like a king being fitted for a shroud, though he clearly saw it as a crown. You're still here, Arthur said without turning his head. His voice was a dry rasp of contempt. I assumed you'd have found a motel by now, or perhaps a park bench that suits your current tax bracket. The tailor flinched, but Elena didn't blink. She watched the way Arthur caught his own reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirrors, a small, self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips. He looked at her through the glass, his eyes scanning her simple scrubs with the same disgust one might reserve for a stain on the upholstery. I have things to pack, Arthur, she said, her voice a calm, steady anchor in the room. Pack quickly, he snapped. He gestured vaguely toward the window, where his silver Maybach sat glinting in the driveway. Julian and I are finalizing the trust transition tomorrow morning before the gala. By the time the first bottle of crystal is popped, your name will be a footnote in this family's history. I've even arranged for a moving crew to take your treasures to the local charity bin if you aren't out by noon. I'm sure the board will be impressed by your efficiency, Elena replied. She felt the weight of the lawyer's business card in her pocket, a sharp edge against her thigh. The board is impressed by results, Elena, something you've never understood. He stepped off the pedestal, dismissing the tailor with a sharp flick of his wrist. He walked toward the mahogany desk, pouring himself a glass of 20-year-old scotch. The amber liquid swirled against the crystal, the scent of peat and wood smoke filling the space. I'm offering you a final mercy. If you want to stay through the weekend, you can work the gala. We need extra hands for the cloakroom. It might be good practice for your next career move. Elena smiled, a thin, dangerous expression that Arthur was too blinded by his own reflection to notice. I'll keep that in mind. She turned and walked out, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She didn't go to her bedroom. Instead, she took the servant's staircase down to the solarium. Aunt Martha was there, sitting in a high-backed wicker chair, a tattered shawl draped over her thin shoulders. The old woman looked fragile, but her eyes were as sharp as flint. As Elena approached, Martha reached out, her fingers trembling as she took Elena's hand. The texture of her skin was like dry parchment, but her grip was surprisingly firm. "He's in the study," Elena whispered. "He's distracted." Martha nodded slowly. She reached into the folds of her shawl and pulled out a heavy, tarnished brass key. It felt freezing against Elena's palm. "The floor safe in the library behind the portrait of my father," Martha breathed, her voice barely a ghost of a sound. "Arthur thinks he changed the codes, but he's an arrogant fool. He never realized the manual override is mechanical. He spent 10 years building a fortress on a foundation of sand." "I'll be quick," Elena promised. "Don't just take the deed, child," Martha warned, her eyes narrowing. "Look for the blue ledger, the one with the offshore stamps. He didn't just steal this house. He's been bleeding the foundation dry to pay for that Maybach and Julian's gambling debts. If you find that, he won't just be homeless. He'll be a pariah." Elena squeezed the old woman's hand and slipped away. The library was a cavern of shadows, the smell of old leather and dust hanging heavy in the air. She moved toward the portrait of the Vance patriarch, a man who looked remarkably like Arthur, sharing the same cold, predatory eyes. She swung the painting aside. The safe was a modern digital model, humming with a faint electronic pulse. Elena ignored the keypad. She felt for the hidden notch at the base of the steel frame, sliding the brass key into a slot that hadn't been used in a decade. The sound of the mechanism turning was a visceral, heavy thunk that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Elena held her breath, listening for footsteps. Nothing but the distant hum of the air conditioning. She pulled the heavy door open. Inside lay stacks of documents, bound in neat clinical bundles. She bypassed the jewelry and the emergency cash, her hands diving straight for a thick vellum envelope. She pulled out the original deed to the estate. Her eyes scanned the elegant script at the bottom. The owner wasn't Arthur Vance. It never had been. The property was held in an irrevocable life tenancy trust, with Martha as the sole executor and Elena's daughter, Maya, as the primary beneficiary upon Martha's passing. Arthur was nothing more than a glorified tenant at will, a man living in a house he had no right to occupy. Then she saw it. The blue ledger Martha had mentioned. Elena flipped it open. Her breath hitched. Page after page of systematic embezzlement, disguised as consulting fees and management costs, all funneling from the Vance Children's Hospital Fund into Arthur's private accounts. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Elena shoved the ledger and the deed into her bag, swinging the safe door shut and locking it just as the library door began to creak open. She slid the portrait back into place and stepped into the shadows of the tall bookshelves. Arthur stepped into the room, his tuxedo jacket discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up. He looked around the darkened library, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. He walked toward the desk, his hand hovering near the portrait for a terrifying second before he reached for a cigar humidor. He lit the cigar, the smell of expensive tobacco swirling into the air. He stood there for a moment, looking out at the dark expanse of the lawn, the king of a kingdom he didn't own. 2 days, Elena, he muttered to the empty room, a cruel chuckle vibrating in his chest. 2 days until you're nothing. Elena watched him from the darkness, her fingers curled tightly around the strap of her bag. She didn't feel fear anymore. She felt a cold, crystalline clarity. She had the paper trail. She had the weapon. And in 48 hours, at the height of his pride, she was going to watch Arthur Vance realize that the only thing he truly owned was the suit on his back. The morning before the Centennial Gala, the air inside the estate felt heavy, like the stillness before a flash flood. Elena Vance stood in the sun-drenched kitchen, her fingers curled around a porcelain mug of black coffee. The steam rose in thin, ghostly ribbons, carrying the bitter scent of roasted beans that grounded her against the rising tide of the next 24 hours. She watched the caterers move with practiced precision, their black-clad forms darting through the hallways like shadows, preparing for the event that Arthur Vance believed would solidify his legacy. He entered the room with the casual, predatory grace of a man who thought he owned the very air people breathed. He didn't look at her at first. He rarely did unless he wanted something. Instead, he adjusted the heavy gold signet ring on his pinky finger, the metal clicking rhythmically against the marble countertop, a sharp, metallic sound that set Elena's teeth on edge. "Make sure my Vance stays in the servants' wing during the arrivals," he said, his voice smooth and cold. He finally turned his gaze toward her, his eyes scanning her simple scrubs with a sneer of pure, unfiltered contempt. "I won't have the charity board wondering why there's a stray child wandering through the foyer. And for God's sake, Elena, try to look like you belong in this house tonight. That dress I bought you cost more than your annual salary at the clinic. Don't embarrass me." Elena didn't flinch. A week ago, those words would have felt like a physical blow to her chest. Now they were just noise, the desperate posturing of a man standing on a crumbling pedestal. She took a slow sip of her coffee, the heat blooming in her throat. "I'll be exactly where I need to be, Arthur," she replied, her voice eerily calm. He let out a short, mocking laugh and stepped closer, invading her space until she could smell his expensive, woodsy cologne, a scent that used to mean safety but now only smelled like rot. "I suppose that's the best I can expect from you. Just remember, after tomorrow, your opinion won't matter. The papers are ready. You'll be back in that cramped apartment by Monday, wondering how you ever thought you were one of us." He turned on his heel and strode out, leaving a wake of arrogance behind him. Elena waited until his footsteps faded before she set her mug down. She walked through the French doors into the garden, where the scent of damp earth and blooming lavender hung thick in the humidity. Aunt Martha was waiting by the stone fountain, her small frame looking deceptively fragile against the backdrop of the massive stone pillars. The older woman didn't say a word. She simply reached into the pocket of her cardigan and pulled out a heavy, cream-colored envelope. The seal was wax, embossed with the original Vance family crest, the one Arthur had replaced with a modern, gaudy version years ago. When Elena took it, the paper felt thick and textured, a physical weight that represented the true ownership of every brick and blade of grass on the property. "Everything is in order," Martha whispered, her eyes sharp and clear. "The trustees are arriving tonight. They think they're here for a celebration. They have no idea they're here for an audit." "Julian is worried," Elena noted, glancing toward the upper balcony where Julian Vance stood, watching them. He looked conflicted, caught between the father he feared and the truth he was finally beginning to see. "Julian will do what is right when the moment comes," Martha said firmly. "He's a Vance, but he's not his father. He has his grandfather's heart." Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first of the security teams began their sweep, Elena found Arthur in the library. He was pouring a glass of 30-year-old scotch, the amber liquid catching the light of the fire. He looked triumphant, already celebrating a victory that hadn't happened yet. "You should take a good look around tonight, Arthur," she said from the doorway. She wasn't hiding anymore. She stood tall, her presence filling the room in a way that made him pause mid-pour. "Some things are only appreciated when they're about to change." He didn't even look up, his smirk visible in the reflection of the glass. "The only thing changing, Elena, is the name on the deed. I'm finally purging the dead weight from this family." "I agree," she said, her voice a low, steady hum of hidden power. "The dead weight is finally being removed." He chuckled, a dry, rattling sound, and raised his glass in a mock toast to the empty room. He didn't see the way she touched the envelope hidden in her silk wrap. He didn't see the cold, crystalline clarity in her eyes. He saw a nurse he had bullied into submission, never realizing he was looking at the woman who held his entire world in the palm of her hand. The countdown had reached its final hours. Tomorrow, the music would play, the champagne would flow, and Arthur Vance would finally learn that the house he built on lies had no foundation at all. Elena turned and walked away, her heels clicking a steady, lethal rhythm against the hardwood floor. The trap was set, the witnesses were coming, and for the first time in 10 years, she wasn't afraid of the dark. By 7 o'clock the following evening, the Vance estate had been transformed into a glittering cage of glass and gold. The scent of 1,000 imported lilies hung heavy in the foyer, cloying and sweet, like a funeral shroud masquerading as a celebration. Arthur Vance stood at the top of the grand staircase, his tuxedo tailored with such surgical precision it seemed to hold his ego together. He swirled a glass of vintage scotch, the amber liquid catching the light of the crystal chandeliers as he watched the vultures arrive. The board members, the local elite, and the hangers-on were all filtering in, their laughter a hollow percussion against the marble floors. He felt invincible. Tonight wasn't just a centennial gala, it was a coronation. In his pocket, the signed transfer of the deed felt like a warm coal against his hip. He had spent 10 years pruning the weak branches of this family, and tonight he would finally sever the last one. Elena Vance entered the foyer 20 minutes later. She didn't arrive with a flourish or a scene. She simply appeared, moving through the crowd with the quiet, lethal grace of a shadow. She wore a dress of midnight silk, its deep color a stark contrast to the pale, fluttering chiffons of the other women. It was the dress of a woman who had stopped trying to blend in. Arthur saw her from his perch and felt a surge of familiar, jagged heat. He set his glass on a passing waiter's tray and descended the stairs, his eyes locked on her like a predator. He intercepted her near the buffet, where 3 prominent board members were discussing the quarterly earnings. "Elena," he said, his voice a low, condescending drawl that carried just far enough for the witnesses to hear. "I'm surprised you found something in your closet that didn't smell like bleach and hospital floor wax." "It's a valiant effort, really." The board members chuckled, a dry, sycophantic sound. One of them, a man named Miller, glanced at Elena with a mixture of pity and dismissal. "Arthur, be kind," Miller said, though his eyes remained cold. "The nursing profession is noble in its own way." "Noble, yes," Arthur sneered, stepping closer into her personal space. He reached out, his fingers grazing the silk of her sleeve with a mock critical eye. "But out of place. It's like putting a plastic cup on a silver tray. You can polish it all you want, but everyone still knows it's just cheap filler." Elena didn't flinch. She didn't look down at her shoes or offer the stammering apology he expected. Instead, she met his gaze with a terrifying, silent calm. The air between them seemed to chill, the humidity of the room replaced by the sharp, metallic scent of a coming storm. "I've spent my life cleaning up messes, Arthur," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I've learned that the things that look the most polished are often the ones hiding the most rot. You'd be amazed what you find when you actually look beneath the surface." Arthur's smile didn't reach his eyes. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper. "Enjoy the champagne while you can. By midnight, you'll be packing your bags. I've already had the locks changed on the east wing. You're done, Elena. The nurse is officially off duty." He turned his back on her before she could respond, a calculated move of dominance, and moved toward the center of the room to hold court. Elena watched him go, her hand drifting to the small, hard shape of the flash drive hidden in the clutch purse at her side. She felt the weight of it, the digital records, the recorded calls, the proof of a decade of embezzlement and bloodline fraud. It was a small thing, no larger than a thumb, but it was heavy with the gravity of justice. Across the room, Julian Vance was standing by the tall French doors, looking out at the manicured lawn. He looked uncomfortable in his father's shadow, his shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. When he saw Elena, his expression shifted from anxiety to a flicker of something that looked like hope. He started toward her, but Arthur intercepted him, clapping a heavy, proprietary hand on the young man's shoulder. "Not now, Julian," Arthur snapped, loud enough for a nearby socialite to wince. "Go find the Sterling twins. Stop moping like a servant. You're a Vance. Act like you own the ground you're standing on, even if your mother clearly doesn't." Julian's face went pale, his jaw tightening as he was steered away. The cruelty was casual, a reflex Arthur didn't even think to suppress. He was at his peak, fueled by the adrenaline of his perceived victory. Elena moved toward the far corner of the ballroom, where Aunt Martha sat in a high-backed velvet chair. The older woman looked frail, her hands trembling slightly as she held a glass of water, but her eyes were sharp as flint. As Elena approached, Martha reached out, her fingers surprisingly strong as they gripped Elena's wrist. "Is it time?" Martha whispered, the sound lost beneath the swell of the string quartet. "Almost," Elena replied, leaning down as if to adjust the older woman's shawl. "The guests are all here. The board is seated. He's about to make the announcement." "He thinks he's the wolf," Martha murmured, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "He's forgotten who actually built the den." Elena straightened her shoulders. She looked out over the room, the witnesses, the enablers, the victims. She saw Maya Vance standing near the entrance, looking at the opulence with the wide, wary eyes of a child who had been told she didn't belong. Elena caught her daughter's eye and gave a single, firm nod. Not much longer. The lights in the ballroom dimmed slightly, a signal that the formal program was beginning. Arthur stepped onto the small dais at the front of the room, tapping a silver spoon against his crystal glass. The sound was sharp, like a gunshot, and the room fell into an expectant, hungry silence. Arthur looked out at the crowd, his chest expanding with the sheer, intoxicating rush of power. He looked at Elena, standing in the shadows by the velvet chairs, and offered a small, mocking toast with his glass. "Ladies and gentlemen," Arthur began, his voice projecting with practiced authority. "Tonight we celebrate a century of the Vance legacy, but more importantly, we celebrate the future. A future where this family is finally free of the weights that have held us back. A future of purity, of strength, and of singular leadership." He paused for dramatic effect, his hand reaching for the microphone. Elena took a single step forward, moving out of the shadows and into the light of the central chandelier. She felt the flash drive in her hand, the cold metal a promise kept. The countdown had ended. The music had stopped. And Arthur Vance was about to learn that the higher you climb on a ladder of lies, the further you have to fall. "I have a special announcement to make regarding the estate deed," Arthur continued, his smile widening into a predatory grin. Elena didn't wait for him to finish. She began to walk toward the dais, her heels clicking a steady, lethal rhythm against the marble. All eyes turned toward her, the silence in the room stretching until it threatened to snap. "Actually, Arthur," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet like a blade, "I think the guests deserve to see the whole truth before you say another word." Elena Vance didn't look at the crowd. She kept her eyes fixed on the man who had spent a lifetime treating her like a footnote in his grand biography. She reached the technician's booth at the side of the dais, her movements fluid and deliberate. The air in the ballroom felt heavy, thick with the scent of white lilies and the ozone of the cooling system. With a steady hand, she slid the cold metal flash drive into the port. "The truth, Elena," Arthur Vance laughed, though the sound was brittle. He gripped the edges of the mahogany podium, his knuckles white. "You've been a nurse for too long. You've started hallucinating drama where there is only legacy." She didn't answer. She simply pressed enter. The massive projector screen behind the dais flickered, then roared to life. It wasn't a slideshow of family memories or a draft of the new deed. It was a high-resolution scan of a document dated 30 years ago, bearing the official seal of the High Court. Beside it, a recorded video began to play, a grainy, private deposition of the Vance family's former estate lawyer, filmed weeks before his passing. The room went tomb silent. The only sound was the hum of the projector and the soft, rhythmic thud of Aunt Martha's cane as she stood up from her front row seat. Arthur Vance's face didn't just change, it disintegrated. The practiced mask of the benevolent patriarch, carved from decades of arrogance and expensive scotch, cracked down the middle. First, the color fled, leaving his skin the gray-white of a tombstone. His eyes, usually sharp with predatory intent, went wide and glassy, darting toward the screen as if he could physically pull the images down with his gaze. A muscle in his jaw began to jump, a rhythmic, frantic twitch that betrayed the terror he was trying to swallow. His mouth hung open, just a fraction, his lower lip trembling as he realized the silence in the room wasn't respect, but the sound of his own execution. The sweat broke across his brow instantly, gleaming under the chandelier light like oil on a dying engine. He looked smaller, suddenly, as if the lies were the only thing that had been keeping his spine straight. This is a digital forgery," he stammered, his voice cracking. He turned to the guests, his hands gesturing wildly. "She's bitter. She's trying to claw back into a family that outgrew her." "The document on the left is the original deed of trust, Arthur," Elena said, her voice amplified by the lapel mic she'd pinned on as she passed the booth. It was a cold, clinical tone, the voice she used when delivering bad news in the ER. "It clearly states that the Vance estate was never yours to inherit. It was held in a feminine entail, passing directly to the first daughter of the bloodline. You didn't inherit this house. You stole it by forging Martha's signature on a waiver she never saw." Julian Vance stood up abruptly, his champagne glass slipping from his fingers. It shattered against the marble, the sound like a gunshot in the vacuum of the room. He looked at the screen, then at his father, his face twisting with a mixture of dawning horror and disgust. He didn't say a word, but he took a step back, moving away from the dais as if the man standing on it were suddenly contagious. Beatrice Vance clutched her pearls so hard the strings snapped, small white orbs scattering across the floor like hail. She looked at her husband, her mouth working but no sound coming out. The socialites surrounding their table began to shift their chairs, creating a physical gap of empty space around the woman they had been fawning over only minutes before. Maya Vance, standing at the edge of the room, didn't look away. She watched her grandfather's collapse with a quiet, somber dignity that he had never afforded her. "I've already sent the originals to the district attorney's office, along with the forensic audit of the estate accounts," Elena said, stepping onto the dais. She stood 3 feet from him, her presence dwarfing his crumbling stature. "You talked a lot tonight about bloodlines and who belongs in this house. You were right about one thing, Arthur. Character matters." She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that the microphone still caught. "And yours just went bankrupt." Elena didn't wait for his response. She didn't stay to watch him scramble or listen to the rising tide of whispers that were already turning into a roar of condemnation. She turned on her heel, the train of her dress sweeping across the stage, and walked toward the exit. She reached Maya, took her daughter's hand, and led her toward the heavy oak doors. Behind them, the first security guards were already entering the room, and Aunt Martha was moving toward the podium to reclaim what had always been hers. Elena didn't look back. She had spent years being the one to stitch people together. It felt remarkably good to finally be the one who tore the rod out. The silence that followed Elena's exit was not empty. It was a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed the oxygen out of the grand ballroom. For 10 seconds, the only sound was the low, rhythmic hum of the projector, still casting the jagged lines of Arthur's financial ruin across his own frozen face. The guests stood like statues, their champagne glasses paused midair, their expressions shifting from shock to a cold, predatory curiosity. Arthur Vance looked like a man watching his own execution in a mirror. The arrogant tilt of his chin had collapsed, leaving his throat exposed and pulsing with a frantic, uneven beat. His complexion, usually a calculated shade of executive tan, had curdled into a muddy, ash-like gray. A bead of sweat broke from his hairline and tracked a slow, jagged path through the foundation his stylist had applied only hours before, leaving a streak of pale skin exposed. His hands, which had spent the evening gesturing with the authority of a king, were now white-knuckled as they gripped the edge of the mahogany podium, the wood creaking under his desperation. His mouth hung slightly open, a dark, silent void where his cutting insults used to live, and his eyes, wide and bloodshot, searched the room for an ally that no longer existed. "This is a fabrication," he finally croaked, his voice cracking like dry glass. He looked toward the front row where his most loyal business partners sat. "Julian, tell them she's unstable. Tell them she's been stealing from the estate." Julian Vance didn't move to the stage. He didn't even look his father in the eye. Instead, he stood slowly, the fabric of his suit rustling in the quiet room. He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a digital recorder, placing it calmly on the table in front of him. "I can't do that, Dad," Julian said, his voice amplified by the sudden, chilling clarity of the room. "Because I'm the one who gave her the passwords to the offshore accounts. I'm the one who filmed you admitting to the inheritance fraud." A collective gasp rippled through the audience. It was the sound of a social death sentence. Beatrice Vance, who had spent 30 years as the silent architect of Arthur's public image, didn't offer a word of defense. She simply set her glass down on a passing waiter's tray and walked toward the coat check without looking back. She didn't need to hear the rest. She knew the smell of a sinking ship better than anyone. Arthur's gaze snapped toward Aunt Martha, who remained seated at the head table, her spine as straight as a bayonet. The smell of expensive lilies from the centerpieces seemed to turn cloying and funereal in the heat of the room. "Martha, you can't let her do this," Arthur hissed, leaning over the podium. "Think of the Vance name. Think of the legacy." "I am thinking of it," Martha replied, her voice cutting through his panic like a blade. "Which is why I've spent the last hour signing the paperwork to return the estate to its rightful management. You were never a leader, Arthur. You were just a squatter with a good tailor." The heavy oak doors at the back of the hall swung open. The sound of hard-soled shoes on the marble floor echoed with a rhythmic, military precision. Two men in dark suits entered, followed by a woman carrying a leather briefcase. The guests parted like the Red Sea, their whispers rising into a frantic hiss of scandal. "Arthur Vance?" the woman asked, stepping into the light of the projector. "I'm Agent Sarah Miller with the Financial Crimes Division. We have a warrant for your arrest regarding the misappropriation of trust funds and systemic tax evasion." Arthur tried to laugh, a high, wheezing sound that held no mirth. "You have no idea who I am. I have friends in the governor's office. I have—" "You have a right to remain silent," she interrupted, her voice flat and unimpressed. As the handcuffs clicked shut, a sharp, metallic sound that seemed to signal the final curtain, Arthur's eyes darted toward the exit. Elena was standing there, framed by the moonlight pouring in from the foyer. She hadn't left yet. She was watching, her hand resting protectively on Maya's shoulder. For a moment, the room vanished. There was only the man who had tried to break her and the woman who had finally found her strength. Arthur's face contorted into a mask of pure, impotent rage. He lunged forward, his movement clumsy and restricted by the steel at his wrists. "You think you've won," he screamed, spittle flying from his lips as the agents hauled him back. "You're nothing. You're an ER nurse who plays with bandages. You'll be back in the gutter within a month." Elena didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She waited until the guards had him firmly in their grasp, his dignity trailing behind him like a tattered shroud. She took a single step forward, the light catching the steady, unwavering calm in her eyes. "You spent your life building a throne out of other people's bones, Arthur," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the silent ballroom. "You shouldn't be surprised when the pile finally collapses. I'm not going back to the gutter. I'm going home, to a house that actually belongs to me." She turned her back on him then, a final, absolute dismissal. She felt the cool night air hit her face as she led Maya down the stone steps of the estate. Behind them, the flashing blue and red lights of the police cruisers began to paint the white columns of the Vance mansion in the colors of a crime scene. The sound of the heavy doors closing for the last time was the most satisfying thing Elena had ever heard. She didn't look back at the lights or the chaos. She looked at the road ahead, where the darkness was no longer a threat, but a clean slate. She reached into her pocket and felt the cold, heavy weight of the master keys Martha had pressed into her hand. They were no longer a burden of responsibility, but a promise of a future where no one would ever tell her where she belonged again. As the engine of her car hummed to life, Elena took a deep breath, the scent of rain and freedom finally replacing the stifling perfume of the ballroom. The reckoning was over. The reconstruction was about to begin. 6 months after the sirens faded into the damp night air of the estate, the world had finally stopped shaking. Elena Vance stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of the newly inaugurated Vance Community Clinic, her reflection ghosted against the glass. The clinical white of her new office was a stark, cleansing contrast to the suffocating velvet and mahogany of the mansion she had left behind. Here, the air smelled of eucalyptus and sterile ozone, the scent of a fresh start rather than the musk of decaying secrets. She smoothed the front of her white coat, feeling the weight of the silver nameplate on her desk. It didn't say wife or enabler. It simply read director. The transition from a weary ER nurse to the head of a foundation hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. She had used the master keys Martha provided not just to unlock doors, but to liquidate the Vance holdings that had been built on a foundation of lies. The door to her office creaked open, and Julian stepped inside. He looked older, the boyish arrogance that once defined him replaced by a quiet, weary maturity. He didn't offer a smirk or a clever comment. He simply handed her a folder. "It's over, Elena," Julian said, his voice lacking its former edge. "The final audit of the estate is complete. The restitution payments to the families Arthur defrauded have been processed. There's nothing left of the old Vance legacy but the name on this clinic." Elena took the file, her fingers brushing the paper. "How is he, Julian?" Julian looked toward the window, watching the city traffic pulse below. "He's living in a one-bedroom apartment in the Heights. It's above a laundromat. He spends most of his days writing letters to the board of directors that no longer exists, demanding they reinstate his parking spot. He wore his best pinstripe suit to the grocery store yesterday because he thought the cashier was a former business rival. The image of Arthur Vance, the man who once commanded rooms with a single raised eyebrow, now reduced to shouting at strangers in a cramped apartment, should have brought Elena more joy. Instead, it brought a cold, hollow sense of justice. He had lost the only thing he ever truly loved, his audience. Without the mansion, the staff, and the terrified respect of his peers, he was just a confused man in an ill-fitting suit, haunting a world that had moved on without him. "He asked about Maya," Julian added softly. Elena's posture stiffened. "And I told him she was busy with her violin lessons," he replied. "I didn't tell him she's the first chair in the youth symphony. I didn't think he deserved to know she's thriving because he's gone." Elena nodded, a lump forming in her throat. Maya was the victory, but the cost was etched into the silence between her and Julian. They were survivors of the same wreck, but they could never truly be a family again. The Vance name was a bridge they had both burned to reach opposite shores. Julian was working in public defense now, trying to atone for the years he spent basking in his father's shadow, while Elena had dedicated herself to the very people Arthur had looked down upon. "Martha would be proud of this place," Julian said, gesturing to the bustling clinic outside the glass. "Martha knew what she was doing when she gave me those keys," Elena replied. "She knew I wouldn't just sit in that house and let it rot. She wanted it dismantled, brick by brick, until something useful could grow from the soil." As Julian left, Elena sat behind her desk and opened the bottom drawer. Tucked away under a stack of medical journals was a single photograph from the night of the gala, the moment before the reveal. In the photo, she looked small, shadowed by Arthur's towering presence. He looked like a king, and she looked like a ghost. She took a pair of scissors and carefully cut the photo in half. She dropped the side featuring Arthur Vance into the shredder, watching the machine turn the wounded wolf into unrecognizable strips of gray confetti. She kept the other half, the image of herself standing tall, even then, before she knew she had the power to end it all. Her phone buzzed with a text from Maya. "Finished practice. Can we get ice cream on the way home?" Elena smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth to touch her face all day. She grabbed her keys, not the heavy master keys of a dead estate, but the simple, light keys to a modest home where no one shouted and no one lied. As she walked out of the clinic, she passed the bronze plaque at the entrance. It didn't mention Arthur. It didn't mention the Vance bloodline. It simply said, "Dedicated to those who seek a way out." The sun was setting, casting long, golden shadows across the pavement. Elena stepped into the light, her heels clicking a steady, confident rhythm against the ground. The reconstruction was no longer a plan. It was her life. And for the first time in 20 years, she wasn't looking back to see who was following her. She was simply walking home.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.